Shalom, and welcome to Chapter 8 of Window on Mount Zion. This is the final chapter, and which will be followed by an epilogue, but we're coming to the end of the story, so let's start Chapter 8, Part 1. This was the Sabbath Eve of June the 9th, in 1967. It was only a week before that Albert had said jokingly but prophetically, "Next Friday we will all go to the Wailing Wall for our service." Then we had smiled at so fantastic a hope. To be back at the Western Wall for our Shabbat service seemed impossible. But now, a week later, 5 days since the commencement of the war, Danny came to us and said, "We're going to the wall tonight for our service, and we'll take you with us." "But nobody's allowed to go there yet," I answered in surprise. "It'll be all right if you come with us." Albert and I looked at each other wordlessly. We could not believe it possible. Then Albert said excitedly, "I must find Rabbi Uri. I promised him last week that we would go to the wall this Shabbat." We also contacted another friend, a rabbi who had been trying unsuccessfully to go to the wall. An hour before the Sabbath began, our little group gathered outside our gate in preparation for the precarious walk down to the wall. A stranger managed to attach himself to us in his eagerness to get there too. He was dressed in a long black satin coat and a large fur-brimmed hat, under which his long, well-groomed side curls almost touched his shoulders. He was a member of the ultra-Orthodox community of Mea Shearim. His thick brown beard could not hide the youthfulness of his face. Our Nachal soldier boys were still in full battle dress, with their Uzis, their guns, hanging over their shoulders. Soon the stranger and the soldiers were in heated argument. The stranger insisted that the boys leave their guns behind, as it was forbidden to carry anything on the Sabbath. "If we don't carry our guns, you can't go to the wall," one remarked. "We are soldiers on duty, and we mustn't move a step without our guns." Just at that moment, we heard shots from the direction in which we were to go. The stranger continued to argue and stress his point, and so we left him to his expounding of the law and went on our way, led by the soldiers, their guns on their shoulders. Even according to Jewish law, we can carry items on Shabbat, such as guns for protection, if it's to protect or save lives. But the stranger had a personal problem to solve, and he did not come with us. It was not yet possible to use the clearing made by the bulldozer. We walked around to the side of the Nachal post. Broken stone steps covered with rusty barbed wire led down to the road on the other side of what had been the border. It was quite a difficult descent, but our boys helped us very lovingly over the broken stones, removing the barbed wire in our path. We followed a narrow road which curved behind an abandoned but well-established Jordanian military camp with its substantial tents and supplies of equipment. I realized then how close they had been to our house on Mount Zion. The light was beginning to fade, and we had to go down more steps darkened by the dense foliage of overhanging trees. Then we found ourselves on the road, facing the church of St. Peter in Galicanti. The little stone houses of Silwan on the hill, rising behind it, were now as close as we'd always seen them through our binoculars. We stood on territory which had been forbidden to us for 22 years. The old city walls, above which rose the domes and minarets of the mosques built on the temple area, seen until now always from a distance, was suddenly so close, so very close, and we were walking towards them. It was surely a dream, a marvelous dream, and this must be the waking moment when one strives to hold on to the vision and bring it into consciousness before it is lost. But was it a dream? I looked at Albert, Raymond, the rabbis, and our soldiers with their guns, walking protectively before us, behind us, and on either side of us. A little procession of awakening dreamers, walking slowly down the road where not a living soul could be seen. Wrecked and abandoned cars were like corpses on the roadside. Everything was silent, so silent that our footsteps seemed to have unending echoes, echoes of the footsteps of all the house of Israel, walking to the wall, to the temple. We passed a few Arab houses as we approached the dung gate, and from each house a piece of white cloth hung from a pole. From the balcony of one house, an Arab man and woman stood watching us, the first sign of life. We waved to them and called, "Shalom!" They returned the greeting, smiling. It was our first greeting of peace to our Arab neighbors. This too was part of the dream. We passed through the dung gate into the old city. We were now within its walls, walking through the winding, narrow cobbled streets lined with old houses. Here you see one of the cobbled, narrow streets in the old city. This is in the restored Jewish quarter, so it's a very beautiful picture with the flag flying and the homes occupied and cleaned. But at the time in 1967, when they were walking through, there was much rubble and much repair to be done. At the end of the road, we walked along the narrow, rubble-strewn roadway, and as we came to the end, there was an opening in the stone wall which revealed part of the greater wall a few yards behind it, a wall built of stone so huge that the others seemed like pebbles by comparison. Still on the edge of a dream, we entered the opening, and with hearts deeply stirred, stood in the small space before those great stones of the western wall, the kotel, the wall with its power of conjuring up visions of Solomon's temple in all its glory. Since the time of the destruction of the temple and the dispersal of the Jews, this wall had received into itself tears of sorrow and mourning, cries of anguish and supplication, prayers and pleas to the Almighty for mercy and restoration that flowed from Jewish hearts all over the world. The bond of the Jew with Jerusalem and the temple could never be severed. The silver cord which carried the cries, prayers, hopes, and faith of the Jews towards this place could not be touched by suffering, persecution, or even death. The world with all its powers could not destroy it. And now the enemies with all their might and determination had not succeeded in preventing the return of the Jewish people to the wall. We did not speak of conquest in this war. Our victory had been the return to the wall, the return to the kotel at the heart of Jerusalem. I remembered my first glimpse of this wall back in 1946. Nothing had changed. I remembered how all the cracks and crevices in the stones had been filled with small rolled pieces of paper on which were written petitions to the Creator of those praying before it, in the belief that here, as in the temple, they were nearer to God and their prayers would be answered. Now only the soldiers were here, but I saw new rolls of paper in the holes in the wall. And now only the soldiers and our little congregation from Mount Zion were praying at this wall on the first Sabbath eve that the old city was in Jewish hands after nearly 2,000 years. After the outpouring of prayers, which came from the depth of the heart, prayers of thanksgiving and praise, the soldiers joined hands, and with their eyes wet, they danced and sang. Their joy seemed to enter into the very stones of the wall, and dry the well of tears, and hush the wails of anguish collected within it over the centuries. I watched Raymond, the Gentile from the nations, being caught up by that little band of dancers and singers. They drew him lovingly into the Jewish family. My thoughts took flight into the future depicted in the Psalm of David, when all nations whom thou hast made shall come and worship before thee, O Lord, and shall glorify thy name. It was such a significant moment in our history. We realized how privileged we were to be present at this special Sabbath service. We were still dazed, for it was an experience which could never be described in words. Things of the Spirit can only be apprehended by the Spirit. Only according to the measure of the Spirit given to us can we in turn measure the importance of a spiritual event. And only by faith can we see into the future revealed by the spiritual event. The soldiers at the wall produced some wine and cakes for the blessing and thanksgiving, in which we all joined. Then we started on our walk back to Mount Zion. It was now very dark. Our Nachal boys guided us back with the same loving care, and we were all in a state of spiritual exaltation. We returned safely to our home and continued the celebration for a while. Police barriers were going up in places of danger. The soldiers were still around, but all was quiet, and there was a sense of peace once again on Mount Zion. On the next Sabbath morning, Albert went as usual to the morning service at the little synagogue. The same faithful band of worshippers as before were present. After the service, they all came back to the house for Kiddush. It was a joyous reunion. Many wet eyes, but such happy faces. After the blessing on the wine and the recounting of experiences, they all joined hands and danced and sang songs of praise. It was surely a God-given miracle, they all said. The previous Shabbat, Rabbi Tolensky had told us about a very holy man, a shoemaker, who was regarded as one of the tzaddikim, the saints, the traditional 36 saints, who constantly uphold Israel before the throne of God. This tzaddik, or saintly man, had died a year ago and left a letter which was not to be opened until the feast of Lag BaOmer. This letter foretold that war was imminent, but that it would only last a few days and end in a great victory for Israel. The prophecy had been fulfilled between this and the previous Shabbat. Well, we will end there. Please join us for part 2 of chapter 8, which will be the last section before we finish with the epilogue. Thank you for being with us. Join us again for part 2 of chapter 8 on Window on Mount Zion.